everyone. Good evening. Good evening to everyone who's here on the call today. We're really excited to have you all. To quickly introduce who we are and what we do, we are TIFA Working Studios. I'm the founder, Trishla Talera, and TIFA is a multidisciplinary center for creativity and culture based in India. And we are an inclusive space for local involvement in global exchange, facilitating critical dialogue, cultural exchange, and experimental practice ever evolving to our context. We have multiple such sessions going on, so hopefully we can have you tune in to some more of them. Just some quick hygiene notes before we start and before I start the introductions of our partners and our speaker for today. Please do share any screenshots and interactions that you're having with us through the Zoom platform, and you can tag us at TIFA India on Instagram and on Facebook at the Talera Institute. To introduce our partners for today, I'm very excited to let you know about the Medici Group. The Medici Group essentially had reached out to us after our first event, which is what this lecture series was titled as, the Medici Effect Lecture Series, which is inspired by a book by Franz, which is called The Medici Effect, and it talks about ideas, the intersection. And TIFA being a multidisciplinary center, we're really excited to be able to bring multiple conversations together and to really create friction at these intersections. And we were really excited to hear Franz Johnson reach out to us himself after he heard about our first event, all the way sitting in New York, and realizing the potential of what we were doing and trying to bring these diverse ideas into the room. And they came on as partners to be able to share their expertise. To give you a little bit of an introduction, the Medici Group is kind of like a think tank or a consultancy that helps multiple companies, Fortune 500 companies, think about how they can be more intersectional and how they can create innovation by making sure that their companies do think in a diverse fashion. We had the previous session physically at TIFA, where we were able to host Praful Talera, who was the speaker for the last edition, to discuss geopolitics and world trade with us. So it was a fantastic session. We're really excited that we can do this digitally as well. I'm just going to quickly take a brief moment to introduce the organization and our speaker for today, Varun Aggarwal. Varun Aggarwal is the founder of India Migration Now, a Mumbai-based migration research, advocacy, and services agency. His research has focused on migration and development. His initial experience with migration research was at the European Institute for Asian Studies in Brussels, where he focused on integration policies for asylum seekers and migrants in the EU. Next, he worked for Dvara Research, previously IFMR Finance Foundation in Chennai, on issues around digital financial inclusion. He has worked on projects with the ILO, Tata Trusts, European Union, the World Bank, amongst others. His initial professional experience came from working for a range of early stage startups in the US. Varun obtained his BA in mathematics from the University of Washington in Seattle and an MSc in economics from Maastricht University. So inviting Varun to deliver the session for today, and we're really excited. Thank you so much, Varun, for joining us today. Just a quick note on the Q&A box and the chat box. The chat, unfortunately, is disabled for participants, but this is where we'll be posting information about the speakers or any links that we need to share. And the Q&A box, as you would see on your bottom, is where we will be able to take any questions from the audience. If there are any issues with anyone logging in at this time, Shaunak will take 2 minutes quickly to make sure that we have all of our participants on board. Varun, inviting you to please unmute yourself and turn your camera on so we can begin.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Trishla, and the whole organizing team for this opportunity. I just want to share my screen quickly. So just 1 second so we can start this process. And right, just want to double check, is the screen visible?
Yes, Varun, it is.
Great. All right.
If I could just request you to go into full screen, please.
Sure. There we go. Great. So yeah, thank you again to the organizer, and thank you for all of you. I think there are people from around the world on this call, and thank you for your time, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to present what is arguably the most relevant issue in India right now, which is migration, and this has not always been the case. So, and in today's, I want to call it discussion, because I think there'll be some Q&A, and I really want to engage with the audience, especially because there's an audience from various backgrounds, so a much more generalist sort of background. So I'm excited to interact with people not in my own field, or policymakers, or people with fancy degrees, but people from different backgrounds who can really reflect on their experiences of migration as I sort of map it. So the goal of today, I thought a lot about how to go about this session. And what I sort of stumbled upon in the end was that I'm going to park the COVID related discussion a bit. I'll refer to it just to ground what I'm saying in the current reality, but I really want the discussion we have to really prompt my response and my analysis of what's happening with COVID-19. And partially it's because it's an ongoing situation. So whatever I say and whatever I explain about what's going on with COVID-19 and migrants in India and outside India, that will be all with a huge pinch of salt, because it's a developing situation. Every day I'm learning something. Every day we all are learning. So I really want people's queries and people's Q&As to inform my analysis and my responses to what's happening with COVID in India and from India. So let's start. So one thing I want to do is I want to offer frameworks. I want to offer a way of processing all this information around migration, especially in the last 2 months in India, a way to process it, a way to perhaps a lens to sort of analyze and think about it. And so I will offer some frameworks before I get into the whole data mapping and all that. So in India migration now, I should say we focus not just in migration within India, which is internal migration, but also migration from India and into India. We take a comprehensive view of migration. And the simple reason for that is that they're all interlinked. The dynamics of migration and why someone migrates abroad and why someone migrates into another state are actually quite interlinked. And I'm going to tease that out. But before that, I really want to sort of expand upon this schematic that you see in front of you. All right, so typologies. So we have immigrants and we have immigrants and we have return migrants, right? The key thing to begin with, though, is that never, like, it's always a household decision. The decision to migrate is always what we call the intra-household decision. And a lot of in the migration studies world, in the work we do in Indian migration now, we always view the situation as not just the worker, but the worker or the student or whatever form of migrant you have, but also the household. And I think that's a really important framing issue. Whenever we analyze and we think about migrant concerns, let's think about the household. So that's the starting point, the migrant household. Within that, we have people who leave and people who come, right? You have immigrants and immigrants. And this can take place at international level, cross-border. It can happen at state level, as we're seeing in the COVID times. So we're seeing a lot of interstate migration happening. And then it can happen, and which is the most predominant form of migration, for instance, in India, and I'll show the numbers in the next slide, is the intrastate migration, which is happening within the state, right? All three have, and what I want to sort of motivate and so talk about is all three offer opportunities for those households and the communities they come from and the communities they go work in or live in, right? Migration really is an opportunity, and there's plenty of empirical proof demonstrating that. But there's also a cost to migration. And that cost, depending on the migration strategy, by which what I mean is the last sort of things you see in the schematic. You have permanent, semi-permanent, you have transit, you have circular and seasonal and chain and force, all these sort of terminology, which is common jargon within migration studies. These are sort of, you can see them as strategies that migrant households deploy to maximize their the one economic way of looking at it is to maximize their welfare and their income. But there are other reasons people migrate, and I'll get into reasons to migrate a bit later, very soon actually, right? So, but all I want, the major takeaway should be that this is fairly representative of all the different kinds of migration that we see. This also includes, by the way, forced migration, which is asylum seekers and refugee in the international context, but within within the country boundaries, within the country borders, it's called IDP, internally displaced persons. And there's an argument that what's happening right now with internal migrants, what has been happening with internal migrants in the last 2 months, qualifies them to be IDP, and this was made in the Supreme Court very recently. So moving on to the next slide. Can we? Yeah, one before that. Yeah, thank you. Right, so let's look at some numbers. Let's sort of, we learned a bit about the different modes of migration and different strategies. So in India, just to demonstrate, this is from the census, the latest data from the census, right? And a thing to keep in mind about the census and the way we measure migration is it doesn't tell us anything about short-term migration, which is migration for which a household member or my person leaves their home for longer than 6 months in the previous year. So if you're spending time less than 6 months, then the census doesn't really capture you, doesn't call you a migrant, right? There are other surveys which do that, and I'll get to them. So this is longer term migration, right? Which is effusively, which is definitively beneficial. Most people who do migrate for longer than 6 months, they see it as an opportunity and they gain a lot from it, and their households tend to be better off than non-migrant households, right? And which is why one of the most important questions, and it's another framing point quite often in migration, given the opportunities that it provides, is why don't people migrate, right? If it's so good, if it's so many opportunities as the studies show, why don't people migrate? And I think that's a really important question in migration. So looking at this, I just want to sort of talk about that majority of migration is happening within a state. If you look at it, the green and the red, almost over 400 million people in this country are just migrating within the state, right? So that's important to keep in mind. And then the blue is the interstate migrant, which is really what captures people's attention, the 54 million long-term migration, right? So, and despite it being a very small yellow, India actually has the world's highest international migrant population, about 18 million based on last count. So just to really motivate the different modes of migration. Next slide, please. Right. This is for me by far my favorite slide, and I can spend all day talking about this. This is how I view migration. This is how I see the dynamic of migration, which is the migrant life cycle, right? Let's start from the source region. You are in your village. Let's assume it's a village, rural to urban migration happening. You're in your village. You see other people who are migrated, maybe in your family, maybe in a neighborhood, maybe in another village, and so you just start thinking, you start pondering that, I have certain aspirations, I have certain ambitions, maybe migration is something I should look into. Maybe migrating to the city is something I should consider. So at the source region, quite often there's a pre-decision stage. There's a whole process which leads to these aspirations to migrate, to develop, and unpack the notion of aspirations in the next slide. Then you get into, okay, you want to migrate, but in order to migrate, you need to have money, you need to have preparation, you need to have a network, you need to have usually a job if you're migrating for work. So there's a pre-departure stage, which is a lot to do with preparation, a lot to do with financing. And one way of very sort of economic way of looking at migration is that it's a household invests into migration and they expect a return in the form of remittances and other forms, right? So that's one sort of framing of migration. But it has its critiques, but it works for now, for our purposes, right? So you pre-depart, then is a recruitment stage. For you to go to the city, how do you go there? You can take a train, or you can take a bus. So that's a transit point. But sometimes you really need a contractor of some sort, which is what half the migration for work is through contractors in India. And it's a very high proportion international migration also. You have these brokers, the intermediaries in the migration process. So you're recruited. Sometimes you might even stop in a transit region, right? So often we see this with Sikh migration, Punjabi migration from India. Often they can't get to Canada or UK or the other Anglo countries, right? So what they do is they hang around for a few years in Europe because it's maybe easier to get a visa there, much more acceptable, right? So they go there, spend a few years and waiting for a way to get to their networks or their families or whatever they want to aspire to in the Anglo countries, right? So the transit regions have a role to play. And then finally you reach destination, there's an employment factor, and then integration. And I'm going to talk a lot about integration. That's where actually most of my work really focuses on, is the integration of migrants. And what I mean by integration of migrants, quite simply put, is this the socioeconomic integration of them in the destination studies, in destinations, right? So you go there, how easily are you able to get employed? How easily are you able to get identity? How easily are you able to get access to healthcare? Do you have the same access to healthcare as a non-migrant? These, education, skilling, all these questions, and I'll unpack them a bit later, are integration questions. And then there's a return component. And we are seeing this right now, where a lot of workers, because of the pandemic, because of the vulnerabilities they face, because of the lack of integration in the cities, want to go back. And basically, this involves a return migration and a reintegration, especially when you've been away for a long time from your place, right? But return migration also requires a certain facilitation, which right now, so there was a Supreme Court order in India saying that the governments in India need to help people trying to return. They can't leave them stranded and suffering, right? So the Supreme Court today, after a lot of work in which we were plugged into, has finally, really sort of come out strongly telling the government, you need to give them free trains, you make up every arrangement so they can go back, right? And then you need to also make efforts to make sure they're safe and they reintegrate well in the source regions. So the life cycle is a very important framing, and I think it will be great to have this lens as I go through my slides. Next slide, please. Right, so I talked about decision to migrate. This is a number one obsession. I would argue it's the number one obsession in migration studies. Why people migrate? It is a tough question because it's a human question. It's like saying why people are born and why people, make life decisions like getting married. It's complicated, but nonetheless, it's a very important question from a policy standpoint, from migrant welfare standpoint. So there's a lot of work being done, and often we think in terms of push and pull in such sort of frameworks. But I want to focus on a framework which I quite like. It's not perfect, but I quite like, is capability and intention. And in fact, I would say not even intention, aspiration, right? So this was created in the context of a project we're doing for Afghani diasporas. And so, this has a forced migration, a refugee element to it. But this is just for demonstrating, is that when people want to migrate, like I said, it's a pre-decision state, there's an aspiration factor, the intention that I want to go somewhere else because somehow I'll be better off. And this doesn't have to be economically better off. A lot of low-cost workers and households choose to migrate because they find a lot more freedom, right? I was hearing an anecdote about Bihari workers who much prefer going to Punjab and working because the farmer's wife, she'll come and give them tea, which is a kind of respect they will never get back home, right? So the idea that they're only going there for wages is incorrect. It takes away from the other reasons, very important reasons why people migrate. Women quite often prefer to migrate somewhere else from where they're from because they find a lot more, find it easier and much more liberal to be themselves and a lot more freedom to, live up to the aspirations they have, which they don't get in the villages, right? So it's important to think of the aspiration factor. And there are positive drivers of aspiration, more opportunities, freedom, rights, but also negative drivers, like forced migration and distressed migration. There is not enough economic opportunity. There's conflict, discrimination, climate change is a negative driver, right? But the struggle really, from an empirical perspective, from a data perspective, it's very difficult to tease out why one reason over the other. It's very difficult. Surveys have not reached there yet, but this framing has improved because of research. So aspirations, but let's say, and keep in mind the question why people don't migrate, right? So one of the more sort of cutting edge way of looking at migration is you aspire to migrate, but does it mean you actually migrate? No, because there's a capability factor, a capacity factor. There's a migration cost. There's a migration information access. You need to have networks. And there's a lot of work done which shows that if the more stronger networks are, key networks are, it makes logical sense, the more likely you're trying to migrate to that country. So Punjabis prefer going to Canada because the initial wave of Punjabi migration in the early 80s, after the violence in Punjab, happened to Canada and UK and US and these countries. And so a lot of them have networks and, in their pinned, they have people there. So the network effects take place, which determine the capability and aspiration quite often to migrate. Migration costs. You need to, the thing is the poorest people in the world can't migrate too far. The poorest people in India are not coming to the cities. They're either not migrating, most likely, or they're going to another district in the same state, or most likely maybe to another village or another field where they can get work in the same district, right? If people are migrating longer distance, it's a good thing. It's a sign of development. The idea that somehow villages being developed will lead to less migration is very flawed. because we know for a fact that more development happens up to a certain point, more migration happens, right? And there's a leveling out point. If you reach middle income status as a country or as a region, then it starts falling down again, right? So it's important to have this framework in mind about this when we think about why people migrate. So there's this rhetoric around keeping people in the villages now they've gone back. It's completely antithetical to what this framework and all the work around the world and more than anything, just talk to workers and talk to migrant workers. And that's like my favorite thing to do is talk to workers, spend time with them, and they'll tell you they're going back because of a fear of pandemic, because they have no savings and they feel vulnerable in the city. But when they go back and they spend time, they already want to come back if they can help it, right? Because of the negative and positive drivers. So yeah, so decision to migrate. Next slide, please. Right, so let's start with immigrants. So I'm going to talk about immigrants, then I'm going to talk about immigrants, then I'm going to talk about internal migrants. So this is talking about our 18 million people outside India, all over the world, the world's largest active migration population, overseas migration population, and who send back 80 billion a year, the largest remittances in history have come back to India, officially speaking. So this is just to sort of get deeper in the initial schematic. So this is the different kinds of migration, and this gets into reason for migration, but also strategy of migration, right? So you have labor migrants, right? I should also add there's also business migrants, right? You have low-skilled, semi-skilled, high-skilled migration happening from India. You have then family migration, and somehow we think our impression of migrants is a man going outside and working. But actually, first of all, a lot of women migrate as labor, and often they migrate because of the system they come from in India. They tend to migrate as a part of a household, but there's enough evidence that they also work and contribute to the remittances which send back, that their work is not officially recognized by surveys and the way we measure things, right? But family migration is a very important consideration. And in fact, from India to Canada, the largest type of migration from India to Canada today is family reunification. Depends, from the Canadian data, we've seen that, right? So family migration, student migration. I was a student migrant. I studied abroad, if you heard my profile. Many of us studied abroad, I think, on this call. So student migration abroad is a huge factor in increasing proportion of migrants from India are students, right? And many of them, what happens is they become students, then they become labor. So this transition happens. And quite often, I mean, keep in mind, like one note is that we call high-skilled migrants for some reason expats. It's a classist term, really. Actually, what they are is high-skilled labor migrants. And a lot of that issue is because of the way the visa regimes are designed, right? They really do have visa regimes around the world, right? Especially the work visa are increasingly classist. But it's important to mind they all are migrants. And it actually does a disservice to the expats because their vulnerabilities they face are somehow sort of shrugged under the carpet, because they also face vulnerabilities. And there's a lot of great work being done with the Indian diaspora in the US about the challenges they face and their households face. This term expat does a disservice to everybody. I mean, in India, before this COVID crisis kicked in, we spoke a lot about refugees and asylum seekers. It turns out many of them also have originated from India, especially when we speak about the Sikh diaspora, which left in the early 80s. Many of them consider themselves asylum seekers and refugees, given that they left troubles, right? So India doesn't have a large population of asylum seekers and refugees, but they do exist, and it's important to acknowledge that, right? Now, the center circle tells about the strategy. So there are people who leave the country, they'll go there, they have a proper visa, but then they overstay their visa. So that technically you become, a lot of people in common parlance call it illegal, but there's no such thing as illegal migrants. It's irregular migrant. In the US, they call it undocumented migrants, which also works for irregular. There's no such thing as an illegal migrant. That term makes no sense, legally speaking, and in the migration context, right? It's basically majority of people who qualify under this category are people who overstayed their visa or took the wrong visa. They went from a tourist visa, started working, right? These are the largest category of irregular migrants. When I started my work, it was during the peak of the European crisis, and so we had irregular migrants coming in the form from Africa and all parts of Middle East, right? But again, there was a confusion. There was what we call mixed migration. You had people who wanted asylum, but also some people who wanted work, who didn't get asylum, then applied for work. It became, these categories after a point become very fuzzy, right? So this is just to offer a sort of a framework. And I'm going to spend more time on the framework than the data. There's a lot of data slides. I'm going to slide through them fast, but I want to really focus on these frameworks because this, for me, is a major takeaway as we try to understand migration, which is such a core part of the world. Please, next slide. Right, data. Look, I already said this is about 17 million. It's about 18 million now from the latest World Bank data. But this is just to show that the linear rise in the number of immigrants abroad. And the thing is, this rise will continue. It might go down in COVID times a bit, but I promise you, till India reaches, really steady middle income status, we get wealthier somehow, this migration will keep only go higher and higher, and it'll get more diverse. It'll get, it's just how it's a part of a country's development. It's the way globalization works, right? So it's important to keep that in mind. This is, next slide, please. Right, this is just to demonstrate where people go. So let me spend 2 minutes on this slide. Let's start with the Gulf. Gulf is a core part for many states like Kerala, Tamil Nadu, increasingly Andhra, Telangana, UP, Rajasthan, Bihar, especially the eastern parts of UP. The Gulf is core. I work with people in the Gulf and who tell me that Dubai is just another Indian city, right? It's been built by Indians. It's increasingly populated by Indians. Much of the Gulf economies have been built by South Asian migrants, not just from India, from Pakistan, from Sri Lanka, from also Philippines is another area where a lot of workers go into Gulf. But yeah, Gulf is a major destination for Indian workers. And the strategy they deploy is not that they want to go and settle there permanently, because that just isn't an option for most people, right? It's that they go there, they work for a year, they come back, or they'll work there for 10 years and come back, but they'll earn enough to live off it for a long time, right? And by the way, this corridor has been majorly disrupted. There's this notion because of the Silicon Valley, the US destinations, that all Indian immigrants are rich. They're not. Many of them come from very deprived backgrounds, and they go to Gulf and get better off, right? So I think the contributions of Indian workers, Indian migrant workers in rebuilding, especially from Kerala and Telangana and such places, has to be acknowledged in building the Gulf. Some of the most expensive cities in the world have been built by Indian labor, right? And very high skilled labor, by the way, which much of which has come back. So it's something for us to think about, how we can utilize this incredibly experienced workers, very high skilled people. How can we can stay true to their aspirations in India? It's a very important question going forward. You might see Pakistan in there, and I think a lot of people get confused by that. But the thing is that there were till not so long ago, there were actually a lot of flow between India and Pakistan. A lot of people who claim to be from India are still in Pakistan, right? And vice versa. Like India actually hosts, and I'll talk about immigrants, actually hosts still a lot of people from Pakistani origin. This is historic. It's not some recent flow. The borders are shut. But till the 70s, there was actually a good flow between people, especially in the border regions, right? It was a very fluid thing, which has become much more precise in the last 20, 30 years for geopolitical reasons, right? Australia, by the way, is a very fast emerging as a destination for Indian immigrants. Much more high skilled nature. Again, a big Punjabi diaspora, but it's becoming a much more cosmopolitan in terms of India. The people settling in Australia, Southeast Asia. I think what happened in Singapore recently with really wealthy city, very smart, very high living standards, the maximum number of millionaires in the world. Nonetheless, COVID strikes. They think they've dealt with it. Suddenly, they discover all these outskirts, these dormitories where they had stacked up workers from India and other parts of South Asia who started getting COVID, right? And they were like, wow, actually, a lot of our workers are immigrants and they're from India and they're suffering predominantly, they're suffering, the predominant cases are amongst them. So, it was a real eye opener for a lot of people in Asia, not just in Singapore, that these people are a big part of our life. Similar kind of stories emerging in Malaysia. And Tamil Nadu, especially is an important source states, and I'll get into source states next. But yeah, of course, Canada, US, the Anglo countries we know. I have done a lot of work in the EU with the European Union. In fact, I just finished a podcast on students from India and the EU. The EU is a very emerging destination for Indian immigrants, for workers and students alike. So I just park it there. Let's move to the next slide. Right, just talk about source states, because in India sometimes we have to appreciate that India is a large country, very diverse. So that it reflects in our diaspora, right? So traditionally from India, especially Gulf context, it was the Kerala, the Tamil Nadu, the Karnataka, especially the Dakshin Kannada region, where a lot of migrants went abroad to and work, right? But in recent times, Andhra, Telangana initially, but then increasingly Bengal, Bihar, Eastern UP I mentioned, these have become very important emerging source states. So people are choosing increasingly, especially amongst the Muslim households, to go and work in the Gulf, to go and work in Southeast Asia. So this trend is changing. We're seeing immigration from different parts. And I think what's important to keep in mind is that the networks in the southern states are much tighter, right? So they're much more secure. The cost of migration is low. But from the northern states, these are recent networks. So the vulnerability factor is a bit higher. It's still a riskier proposition for a UP migrant going to Gulf than for a Kerala migrant going to Gulf. So that's important to appreciate that. Next slide, please. Right. So this is a bit of fun, but I think it has a lot of meaning. This is in Punjab, the Doab region, where the majority of migration happens. So, the reason this is a water tank, which you'll find in many households in Punjab. And the idea is, if you see this in Punjab, and you can very easily see this in Punjab in the houses there, it means that that's an immigrant house. It's a sign that it's an immigrant house. Next slide. I took many of these I found. Look at this, another one, right? And the bigger it is, the more successful you are. So migration has this amazing reputational factor. You want to signal your migration. You want to be like, yes, I've gone abroad and made it. And this is part of the aspiration. This is the actualization of the self-actualization of the aspirations of a migrant. And Punjab was a great study in that, right? Next slide, more. Like this is a particularly successful worker. He went, a migrant family must have gone to Canada, done very well. The bigger it is, the more better you've done. Next slide, please. Yeah, I thought this was very interesting that, they had a actual water tanker instead of, plane or usually, just to reflect the actual water tanker. So yeah, so the point is signaling. People are signaling the fact that they've gone abroad. In Kerala, I know I work with Dr. Rajan, one of the leading scholars in this country. He always says, if you see a fancy house in Kerala, either the person's corrupt or he's an immigrant. So just to look at the source impact of migration. Next slide, please. Right, so this is very interesting. So this was from some of the failed work. It's actually a failed project of ours to make a documentary in Italy, documenting the Punjabi community there. So believe it or not, the best cheese in the world today is made by Punjabi dairy farmers, buffalo tenders, who went from Punjab, settled in Italy, and now took over the fledgling cheese business in northern Italy around Milan and Venice. And this is actually in Italy, this Dvara. In fact, next slide, please. I actually went to Google Maps and checked. These are all Gurdwaras in northern Italy. So many of them, and it's a pretty, it's a very significant community there. And just to sort of showcase the new trends of migration, right, and how they establish themselves, and they're now increasingly accepted as a part of the local communities because they're around Padua and Verona. A filmmaker who was trying to work on this with us was in Padua, and he said he was just amazed how it felt like Punjab, So just to sort of illustrate some of the things I'm making. Next slide. Right, immigrants. Let's talk about, unfortunately, a controversial issue in India. Unfortunately, but I think it's important. This is a census. This is all census. This is the UN figures. And the UN figures are fairly reliable. They're not perfect. But I think the trend is if we can trust the trend, the number of immigrants in India has been falling, and I don't need the numbers to tell me that. Like if you talk to workers and households in Bangladesh, the typical source of immigrants in India, Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lankan Tamils, India is no longer a preferred destination. They're much like Indians prefer going to Southeast Asia or Gulf or US if they can help it, right? So even there, look, these economies are also developing. So their aspirations are also evolving. It's no longer about working in Indian cities, right? So just to sort of talk about the trend of immigrants in India. And this includes obviously, employment reasons, student reasons. It includes the expat community, so to call it, the high skilled workers, the business owners from abroad. So this is a number which encapsulates all of that. Next slide. Yeah. So I'm not going to spend too much time on the asylum seekers and the Rohingyas. I could have spent a lot more time talking about that. I'm just going to talk about the economic reasons why people migrate. So I want to look at Nepal, which is a really important corridor for us. This is a comparison of the Nepalese census and the Indian census, and it's just to show that it's a similar number. So the number of Nepalese migrants has increased somewhat in India, and I think a lot of it has been driven by by two things. One is Nepal's development has sort of stopped a bit for various political reasons there, right? So many of them have, instead of, many of them have aspired to go abroad, and many of them do, but many of them couldn't go too far away, so they prefer coming to India, right? And this includes both short-term Indian Nepalese migrants who work in the orchids, of the Himalayas, right? So there are a lot of people from the Himalayan regions, of the mountain regions of Nepal, who come into the mountain regions of India and work there like seasonal migrants, like any other Indian state. But many of them, obviously, in Indian cities, we are very familiar with Nepalese people working in different sectors of our small economy, the MSME economy. So just to sort of showcase the very close relationship we have with Nepal. By the way, there are a lot of Indians in Nepal. The best plumbers in Nepal come from Odisha, right? So a lot of, in Kathmandu, a lot of the workers you will find are from India. So it's a both way. Migration happens both way between India and Nepal. So so yeah. Next slide, please. Right. So let's get to the real hot topic. Though I think immigration is both immigration are equally hot topics right now. But I think the headlines in India have been made by migration within India. So let's start with this. This is an adaptation of the framework I showed earlier. So the red obviously signifies the people who have been impacted by the lockdown in the last 2 months. So yeah, labor and business migrants, construction workers, textile workers, people who sit in a stall and sell you street food in your bhel puris in Bombay, your guards, your maids, everybody's been very impacted by the COVID lockdown. And also families. I think the images, the images of how we portrayed the crisis really hasn't done justice to women and families, because they have also suffered big time, and we need to keep that in mind. And I think I talked about IDPs earlier. And I think that there is a case to be made, like what has happened to them. They shouldn't be considered a humanitarian crisis as IDP, as a forced migration. It's not a line of thought we could pursue legally, but I think analytically, as we go forward, this is a line of thought I want to pursue. Is looking at this crisis from an IDP perspective. Students was interesting. There was a lot of quota, where a lot of people go study for IITs and everything. Students not as vulnerable as labor migrants and family migrants, but they were stranded too. So they're in yellow. But who? So there are different categories of we call economic migrants and family migrants, right? In India, we have the predominant strategy, especially when you're crossing states, is what we call cyclical. It's a temporary form of thing. It's a Mumbai taxi driver, for instance, would spend 30 years in Bombay, right? But he will still go back to his native UP, Bihar, right? Because that's where they own their land. That's where they're from. Somehow they will speak perfect Marathi, but they will never settle in Bombay for good, right? So that's what we call a semi-permanent migration. They spend, close to 12 months, sometimes over, and then they go back, and then they come back for holidays, and then they go back to Bombay, and they keep doing the cycle for 30 years. Then you have the temporary seasonal migrants, and these are the ones which the census doesn't capture, and these are the ones who really, immediately the lockdown was announced, even before that, started going back, because they are by design only meant to be there for a bit, right? They have low savings. It's a very light touch strategy. They come, they work, and they go back, right? And usually a lot of this migration happens in the agriculture off season, when the harvesting is done, the sowing is need to be done, and that's when they come supplement their income in the cities, and they work in construction, and I'll show which sectors they work in, right? So just to appreciate and the nuances of who suffered and who's more vulnerable than others, right? Next slide, please. Right. So this is just to highlight what I made earlier, that the intrastate migrants far outstrip interstate migrants in India, right? This is just to highlight that fact. Next slide, please. Right. So this is an important one. And again, this is the way it's measured, right? So this is not necessarily reality, but it's just the way it's measured in the census, right? So people break it up into rural to rural migration. This is the, if anybody's seen Urta Punjab, you know, I mean, I mean, that was the most prominent depiction of this rural to rural migration, especially across states, was Bihari workers working on the Punjabi fields, right? Punjabi people, and again, this reflect back on the interlinkage between international migration and internal migration, right? A lot of Punjabi people aspire to go abroad where their pin network is, right? So there's a lot of labor shortfall, especially in the harvesting season, which the Bihari workers who need the work, who land's too small or don't have land, go there and you know, reap benefit. And they're excellent workers and they have great reputation in Punjab. And you know, they also feel freer, right? But many of them actually were stranded and they actually went back in the COVID crisis. So there's actually been a shortage of workers in the harvest season in Punjab this time. So that's rural to rural migration. Rural to urban is what we all talk about, right? Actually, rural to urban migration in India is actually not that much. It should be actually a lot more given where we are in our stage development. If you compare other countries at the similar stage of development, they had a lot more rural to urban migration. You know, we don't actually have enough. It's been decelerating, if anything. But again, keep in mind, this is a census data. This is a longer term migration, not shorter term migration. Shorter term migration is a whole different story. But longer term migration, the real sort of benefit, you know, migration which actually reaps a lot of benefits for workers and households, for sure, is what's decelerating. And that's a concerning thing in our development trajectory. I want to talk about urban to urban migration also. Like, you know, a lot of, especially in the South, we're seeing a lot of migration from the North to the South. Actually, a lot of it is driven by urban to urban migration. I myself was an urban migrant in Chennai. I'm from Delhi originally. In a way, I'm in Bombay, right? So an urban to urban migrant. So urban to urban migration is an increasing phenomenon. Look at the acceleration in the third 2011 census there. So, you know, just to sort of map that out. Next slide, please. Right. Yeah, so just to talk about interstate migration, that sort of dominates our thinking. You know, rural to rural, urban to, so it's rural to urban it's the most common. Urban to urban, which people don't talk about, is actually, you know, a huge part of the migration now. And rural to rural, which is increasingly, you know, for agricultural reasons and other reasons, is quite common. Yeah, next slide, please. Right, so again, this is, you know, I mean, this is the way census measures it. Think about the aspiration and capability framework that I sort of motivated. The census does not tell us anything about that. In fact, it tells us most people migrate for marriage, right? Which inherently does a disservice to all the women migrants in this country, because many of them actually work. But, you know, if you ask them why you migrate, they say, because I got married. But they're actually also working, but we don't ask that question, right? So we have this sense of that women migrants are the most common form of migrants, and they only migrate because of marriage, right? So you know, this is a lot to do with how we measure things, right? And how we measure things really creates the imagination that we have of our own country. So I think we need to be very critical consumers of this stuff, right? So this is more of a cautionary tale than you know, I won't take this too seriously. Next slide. Right. Quickly, just to show the geographical spread of it. Maharashtra and Kerala, you know, as you can see, are very, very dependent on migrants, and you look at Uttarakhand and where you see a lot of Nepalese migration, you see a lot of UP migration. Punjab, I mentioned earlier, you know, in the purple, those Goa. So, I mean, the dependency of migrants in each country, and that's what comes through this chart, and that's what I wanted to be here. So. Just to showcase the dependency factors. And this is 011. I think if the next census happens, whenever that happens, you will see a lot more South India states having a lot more purplish color, because that has just been booming. And next slide, please. Right, so these are the top corridors. The one way of looking at migration is in terms of a flow from one state to, so this is on the left, you have the source states, on the right, you have the destination districts. So as I said, the Mumbai taxi driver, right? The UP to Mumbai suburban, the Bandra side from near Allahabad. That's a real common corridor, and it's a huge part of the Indian story. It's a long-lasting link we have with UP and Bombay, you know, which I think I romanticize that. I think it's a tremendous link we have with them. Thane and Surat and Delhi, you know. Think about the crisis. Think about what we just went through. Majority of the issues, majority images we were getting images from all over the world, all over India. But specifically Delhi, Bombay, you know, that's where bulk of the migration is actually happening, right? Yeah, next slide, please. Yeah, this is sort of a personal thing. This is My mother's side of the family originally came from Rajasthan, and this is Fatehpur in Shekhawat region. And this is not our house or anything, but this is basically the typical kind of Haveli which the Marwadi merchants left behind, and this will retain that as a way, these migrations happened hundreds of years back, 200 years back, but this is a sign of those migrants. They have maintained these Havelis, and they retain them in places like Fatehpur, which is, by the way, it's amazing. It's an amazing architectural journey to go there. But just to show the nature and the history of internal migration in India. Next slide, please. Right, so I won't spend much time. This is just to demonstrate that Kerala, which is in Kerala today, where most of people, it's an aging population, most of them have gone to Gulf, there's a labor shortfall, much like Punjab. And today, a lot of migrants, every sector, every region of Kerala is dependent on migrant workers. But Kerala actually treats them very well for various reasons. And I'm going to unpack that. But just to sort of demonstrate, they come from all over India and Kerala now. You can quadruple your wages from Bengal to Kerala if you work in agriculture. It's quite crazy. Let's go. Next slide, please. Right, so this is some recent data pulled. Well, recent in the sense we pulled it recently, but the data is from 2007. This is short-term migration, right? And this is actually the migration which is the most common in India, arguably. And it's just showcase that if you look at the top chart, where are they working? Most of them are working in agriculture, in construction, in manufacturing. So a lot of automobile manufacturing, the sub-plants to sub-plants, that's where a lot of these short-term migrants work. And many of them have now gone back home because of the pandemic. They fear, they want to go back. And there are huge labor shortages in all these sectors, both in urban areas and rural areas, by the way, right? In terms of destination, this is just to showcase the nature of short-term migration, which is between 1 and 6 months away from home. Many of them do in the same district, but a lot of them go to another state. In fact, unlike longer-term migration, a lot of short-term migration, especially when it's neighboring states, that's the interstate migration that we see predominantly. And those were actually the people who really walked back. They're particularly vulnerable, right? So they were particularly vulnerable. They don't have much savings. They live very, Dr. Srivastav, who I absolutely admire, he says, they're dirty, dangerous, deprived sort of existence that they have. And I think that's the reason they were so keen to go back. It was not because somebody forced them to go back. Nobody forced them to go back. I was talking to workers throughout. It was because they had no hope in the city. And majority of them from this background, the short-term background, right? That a lot of these workers we saw on Sassoon docks have suffered quite a bit in this crisis. And all the livelihood was taken away. Many of the fishermen who used the ice to fish were stranded. And when they came back, they realized the lockdown has happened. So it was just to sort of relate with what has happened to them, right? Just quickly the next slide, and then I'll quickly move on to questions. I don't want to take too much time. I just want to talk about this because I want to talk about integration, because that's particularly the work we focus on. Integration, like I said, means it's basically how migrants, the kind of opportunities they get to the playing field, how level it is for them versus vis-a-vis the natives, right? But it has many dimensions. This is an index which I've designed, and now we use actively. My team has sort of built it based on my design. So the policy areas that matter are labor market. So, how easily able to access labor market vis-a-vis natives, education, children's rights, social benefits, political inclusion, housing, identity, health, and science. These are different dimensions of what I mean by integration. And the thing to keep in mind with this whole COVID, what I call, it was not a migration crisis, it was a migration policy crisis, because migrants in India, are excluded from the destination. They go to cities, they work, and they barely get any recognition, right? And one of the major problems is they can't vote. They can't usually vote back home, and they can't vote usually where they are. The political exclusion of migrant workers, of which, as we saw, there are many, hundreds of millions of them. They're a huge part of our country, right? It's a way they live up to they actualize their aspiration. We are making it very difficult for them, which is why they went back, right? I'm going to actually stop there, and I'll take questions now.
Thank you, Rohan Nahar, for your question. Rohan would like to know, I would like to know, why do you say that migrations will keep on growing in India? Is it majority majorly because of the difference in incomes of the rich and poor? And also, do you see migrations as positive and negative?
Well, let's answer the first. Thanks for the question, Rohan. Thank you very much. Do I see migration positive? I absolutely see it as a positive. The catch line of my company is migration is an opportunity, but we have to help India grab it. The nuance is, as I've spoken about, there's a cost to migration. And we need to keep that in mind. People sacrifice their bodies, their lives to, they're heroes, as Professor Rajan tells me, they're heroes for their households, for their communities. They migrate, they earn, they go, and they never go back empty-handed. They never go back empty-handed. But this crisis, they had to go back empty-handed. They had to beg, So I see them absolutely as heroes. The act of migration is a extension of human agency. It is definitely a positive, but bad policies and politics make it a negative. Is it a major? Okay, we'll keep on growing in India. Second question, let's look at the middle question. Difference between, no, that's not why migration happens. That framing, that inequality framing is important at a macro level, but think about the framework I offered, aspiration and capability, right? So the first question is, who all aspire to, who all want to migrate? And the answer is a lot of them want to migrate, because especially from a lower income background, lower sort of historically backward community, a low caste community, migration is a way to improve your circumstances. The more you're aware of it, the aspiration of migration is very much there, right? So that better keep that in mind now. But who can actually migrate? And that's where the rich and poor factors come into play, right? So that's the nuance, right? The richer you are, the more capable you are to migrate. But maybe if you're rich, you don't aspire to migrate, at least not migrate within India. You might want to study abroad or work abroad. Your aspiration might be different, but you still want to migrate, right? So the rich and poor nuance is important, but at a very macro level. Then many other factors will determine why people migrate. Why do you say migration will keep on growing in India? So let's be clear, migration from India and within India, right? What we've seen around the world is that the poorest, like I said earlier, addressed the other question, are not able to migrate too far, even if they want to, right? As our countryside gets wealthier, and that's an assumption I'm making, right? And which is not going to be the case next 2 years, but as it gets wealthier, these aspirations there'll be more opportunity and capacity to fulfill these aspirations to migrate, right? So that's why I think as India develops, we'll see a lot more migration, longer-term migration within India and from India. It is a natural developmental process. 50% of our labor force works in agriculture. That's unsustainable. Migration is the way this transition will happen from agriculture to other more productive economies, sectors of economy. It's the same in the US, it's the same in China, it's the same in South Korea. It's just the way countries develop. It's a demographic reality. Next question.
Varun, sorry, I was asking a question because we asked in a quiz earlier today, yesterday actually, that Kerala has one of the easiest, if that's the right word, migrant policies. And since you touched upon policy, I wanted to know if what are these policies that Kerala has, so that we can kind of maybe learn from those policies.
Sure, absolutely. So I think what Kerala...
And we'll take Rashmi's right after.
Right. No, fair enough. No, so it's a great question. And I think it's what Kerala does well, and it actually scores the highest in our index. What Kerala does well is, it recognizes the importance of migrant workers from other parts of India and their society. That's the first thing. There's an acknowledgement. Unlike many other states, they've acknowledged their role, and because they acknowledge it, there's this culture of being inclusive of labor. And labor is an important factor. It doesn't matter where they're from, right? Because they acknowledge it, the political culture and the bureaucrats have put out policies around housing. They've targeted housing policies for migrants, short-term housing. They have come up with special ID cards for migrant workers, so that using those ID cards, they can access some welfare. By the way, these are not perfect measures. These are new measures, but this initiative is what counts. The fact that migrants have been considered an important stakeholder in their society, right? And the part of it is because the socialist, the more labor-friendly sort of political culture they have, but also because they realize that how much of their state, which is about 30% of the GDP, and I think it's gone down a bit, but 30% of GDP not so long ago was based on remittances from Gulf. So that empathy also, I think, is a part of the reasons, right? So yeah, the longer short is they care about migrants, and the policies around housing and welfare come from that. Yeah.
said, if we can have the next question up by Rashmi. So Rashmi asks that it's really interesting that we keep complaining about rural-urban migration, but there's also a high reverse between urban and rural migration in the last decade. Why do you think that is? This is the first part. So let's do this one, and then we'll come to the second one.
Like what I said, the Mumbai taxi driver, 30 years, he'll work in Bombay, but then sometime he'll retire, no? He'll go back. That's where the reverse migration happens. People retire, people stop their careers and they go back. Sometimes people get demotivated. They come here. I've spoken with workers who like new workers, spend a couple of years, didn't work out, don't like the city. I'm going back. I'll try again, maybe later. Maybe I won't try, right? It's a risk. Not every migrant who comes to the city is successful, right? Many of them are. But but many of them, because the city is not a place where they want to stay permanently for cost or whatever lifestyle reasons, they'll go back. So that's where a lot of the urban rural migration is happening. And that is obviously taking great prominence right now. We're seeing this idea of reverse migration. But this is obviously, that's a very different reason. Right now is the pandemic driven, the lockdown driven. These are very unique circumstances, but typically it's because of people just going back home for good. What are the other data sets that I dip into? NSSO, I actually refer to that, the National Sample Survey. 07 had a module on migration, which tells us a lot about short-term migration. There's also the India Human Development Survey, which is fairly representative of the country, not so much a local level, which I dip into quite a bit. There's a third round of that happening. We actually maintain a India Migration Data Portal at India Migration Now. You can access to a website. It's completely public. You can take the data, anything you want. And what we've done is we also sort of aggregated a lot of micro studies. We have almost 100 micro studies across different states and different corridors, because there's a lot of, quite often migration, was not a prominent question in the development community. It was a one question a migrant they will have. So we've tried to find all those studies and put them together so that you get a more micro level picture also. So those are the things I dip into. There are other things, remittance data, the company data. There are a lot of strategies or data I've been applying. Yes, there's some big data work happening with the IOM. They're using Facebook data, mobile network data. Nothing perfect, but yes, there are things we can do. I'm happy to have a longer conversation about this maybe afterwards. Yeah, as a follow-up to this. Yes.
Super. So I'll take the next question, Varun. And all of these questions are really interesting, and I hope we have time to go through all of them, but maybe we can touch upon them. Next question is by Nilesh Vora. What is the typical lifestyle? Ashni, we'll do yours right after this one because it leads into Rashmi's earlier one. What is the typical lifestyle income trajectory of an immigrant from rural to urban? And what income level do they decide to move with their families to the urban destination? Also, what, in your opinion, can we do to improve the slave-like lifestyles of the urban poor? Do you think personally that they are better off working back in their roots, in their rural roots?
Yeah, found it. So, okay, what is the typical lifestyle income trajectory of an immigrant from rural to urban?
Yeah.
Depends on strategy. There's a long-term strategy, a short-term strategy. Short-term, there are many things, many different variations of this, but I know construction sector really well because that's where I do a lot of my field work, and we do a lot of work with construction sector. Typically, a worker will come, they'll have a 3-month strategy, 3 to 4 month, and depending on a low-skilled worker, right, which is the most common form of interstate short-term migrant. And they'll come with a 3-4 month strategy. They come and work here. They'll stay on the site most likely, or they'll rent something, depending on the kind of site they are. If there's a nice big Tata site, they'll have housing there, which is cramped, but it's there on the site. They live there. If they have a smaller site, then sometimes, we see labor often in India sleeping on the site, and no room, no fan, they're sleeping right there, right? And so one thing you need to quickly understand is that 90% of what they earn will go back home. The money they save on housing is the premium they are able to make by moving here, right? 10% is spent on food and income. They want to save as much as possible in housing. So that's one important factor, is a remitting factor. They usually typically will earn, depending on the skill level and where they're working, they might earn a daily wage if they're working in the NACAs, the open labor markets. They might earn a weekly wage. They might earn a piece-wise wage depending on the amount of work they finish. And finally, they might get monthly if they're an organized like a Tata site, right? So it really depends on the skill level and where they work. At what income level they decide to move their families to the urban destination? That's a great question. And I don't have an answer to that question. That's a great question. I wish I had a good answer. We don't know. We don't know. I think that's a fabulous question. We will have to find out more about how these short-term migrants are transformed into long-term migrants that bring their families. But I tell you what, it's not just income, it's housing. One of the number one problems workers face in India, in our cities, is housing, right? So it's a function of housing right now. What, in your opinion, can be done to improve the slave-like lifestyles of the urban poor? Right. I mean, I talk about integration. I mean, first and foremost, I mean, why do our states who rely on the labor of these workers have domiciles? They have reservations for natives. They have all these domicile-based barriers which deny people housing and welfare and all kinds of, entitlements. They do all the work, but they are, because of whatever political, some of the soil kind of culture we have in India, we are denying them what they're entitled to, the safeguards they should be given. So getting state governments and state societies, we need to recognize in Bombay, in Chennai, in different cities where workers come in, that these people are our citizens, they are fellow citizens, and they need to have equal opportunity and equal access to things as we do, right? Second, and this is a larger problem, not unique to India, is that, a lot of our social welfare system, a lot of our government policies for the poor are very much focused on rural areas. And they assume they're rural, the poor, and they assume they're static, right? But the reality is increasing number of poor in India is actually urban and mobile. So one of the failures of the last 2 months was this. The government's not aware of it. I critique the data they have. But also at the same time, they have a system which is just not designed to service the poor, whether relief or otherwise, right? Like they kept using the policies they had to, we'll give 1,000 rupees there, 500 rupees there. But those benefits were never realized on the ground, never realized, because those systems just don't work. People are not aware of it. So I think these are two things. There are many other things. And I really encourage you to look at our portal, by the way, I'm going to share, pravasi.help. Pravasi.help is a portal we have created to educate and advocate on behalf of migrants. They're better off moving back to rural roots? No, I don't think so. And by the way, it's not my decision or your decision, it's their decision. If they think they're better off, they'll go back. If they don't think they're better off, they'll come back, right? So I don't know. It's their decision. The key thing is it should be their decision. It should be every Indian is a constitutional right. We can live and work where we want within India. And that right should not be denied. So it's their decision. They're better off in the rural roots? Probably from a low-caste community, probably not. Especially from low-caste communities, because the stigma in our villages is just next level. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Varun. I will take one last question. Before that, there is a feedback link in the chat section below. So please do take time after the session to fill it out. I'll take the next question by Ashni, which we had brought up earlier. Varun, did your research provide any insights into forced migration by the way of trafficking? And I know this is a controversial point of view also, because we all know that it happens, but I don't know if there's any numbers to back these studies.
I don't have numbers to quote right now, and trafficking is something, but yes, absolutely. I mean, forced migration by the way of trafficking is a reality. It happens within India. It happens from Bangladesh, women, Nepal. It happens from India to Gulf. Trafficking is a reality, and it's a terrible reality. But we have to keep in mind, one nuance I always want to make is the difference between trafficking and smuggling. Huge difference. Smuggling is not forced. Smuggling is just a network which has been created where people actually willingly want to go because they have no other way of going officially. So smuggling networks are different. Trafficking, what are my insights? Well, one thing to keep in mind is it's got the international and internal dimension. We need to appreciate that, right? Second, it's not just women, but children and even men, who are trafficked. And it's not just a sex trade, but they're workers, forced labor is happening in various forms, especially in rural to rural migration, So those are some of the insights out. It's not my particular expertise, but those are the insights I know from the work that I've read. We actually have an anti-trafficking law in India, which was updated not so long ago. So I encourage you to look at that. And I'll pause there. I'm happy to, again, follow up on these things and connect you with better resources, even better people who are doing excellent work on trafficking and in preventing it and so on. Yeah.
Fantastic. I'll take one more question, which is actually multiple segments by Preeti. You can take a second if you need to drink water, sorry.
No worries.
So it's a startling fact to know that 40% is migrating within the country. I cannot get my mind around this number. What is the trend in other countries? is the question. Also, why are we not learning from developed nations on different migration? This is a question by Preeti.
Right. I'm just trying to understand within the country. Is she talking about the first slide where I was talking like majority of migration happens within India? Is that where it's coming from? Or is it the within the state is she referring to? I would love to clarify that point.
She's saying 500 miles. So I'm guessing within the state.
Right, right. No, so the reason is we are poor. I mean, the question is regarding most of the migration in India is happening within states. That's because of the fact that many people are poor. They don't have the social network or the capacity, even if they want to migrate to cities and other far off destinations, they can't. Think about it this way. Most of our diaspora abroad from India is upper caste. Nobody talks about this, but in the US, if you look at the immigrant population we have, even people like me, we are upper caste people will go and study and work there, right? And so most of the lower caste migration, which is a large part of our country is low caste, they don't have the capacity or the freedom or the agency to go anywhere beyond their state or often even their districts, right? So what is happening in other countries? I don't know. I can find that out. How much is it provincial, and how much is inter sort of between different provinces? I can find that out. The migration crisis during COVID in the country surprises the policymakers. And yeah, well, we were not surprised. Well, we started an organization to fix this very problem, so we were not surprised at all. Government doesn't know. They don't know for various reasons, and it's the implications of government not knowing. We're seeing it now. People are dying in hunger, eating dog meat. I mean, it's like I said, these are heroes who were made into zeros, and when they usually they're begging on the way back, when they actually go back with their chati phad ke aate ghar wapas, because we earned, we take care of them. So yeah, no, it's a complete. And by the way, it's not the current government. This is a historic problem in this country. We just haven't managed and given enough importance to migration, right? One silver lining is maybe now we will. Right. And I think that's why I'm happy to speak in these forums. I'm glad I'm getting these opportunities because we need to advocate and need to bring this issue further and learn about it and talk to our workers and, really cultivate empathy, and not just in research, but in art and on different domains, right? Why are we not learning from developed nations? I don't think we need to learn from developed nations. I am not interested in learning from Europe. I have worked in Europe. We should learn from developing countries. We should learn from Vietnam. We should learn from Thailand. We should learn from Brazil and Mexico. These are the countries we're going to learn from. Not the developed world. Let's forget this Eurocentric view we have of how the world works, right? So I think there's a lot we can learn. I think the fact China has a very controlling. China is an interesting analogy to create. They have a hukou system. So basically, when you're born in China, you're either given a rural identity or an urban identity, right? Because China. And it's a very sort of demonizing, classic Chinese way, a very demonizing way of managing the situation, but they recognize, their planners recognize the importance of migration and managing it, right? Which in India, we never did, right? And it's such a huge part of our demographic transition and such a huge part of our development process. We never did, right? So I think you're right. We should learn from other countries, but not developed. We should learn from developing countries. There was a question somebody asked about mental health care, which I thought was very important and relevant to the current situation. The person who asked that question, you're absolutely right. Mental health is a big problem with migrant workers. Huge area of apathy and not much work is happening in that space. In fact, one of the things we are getting slowly involved in, and I know a lot of helplines have come up, is counselors getting on the call and they're calling up workers, they're setting up helplines too, because workers have really gone through a traumatic experience, when they've gone back home, and they feel their dignity has been robbed and they feel very discouraged. So, mental health is very important, especially when you're alone, you're away from home, you're stuck with a bunch of people in a cramped room, there's a pandemic outside, not forget pandemic, even generally, it can be very depressing. So I think it's a very important dimension. I know the ILO and the IOM have looked into this. I know some NGOs who do work on this, but I think mental counseling and generally healthcare for migrants is a very important space. And I hope to see more work on that front post-pandemic.
Thank you for that question, Siddharth. That was the question that Siddharth has asked. So thank you for that. Varun, if you don't mind, and if you have a few minutes, we can take maybe one or two more if you're open to it.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll ask the question that Anuja has posed to us. could all the data that migrants within India, if be presented to a richer, more privileged citizens, especially in Bombay, Delhi, would it help integrate them into these places? So maybe have a better interface to have this data more visible to people.
Sure. Yeah, I think data, yes, but like I said, data, you have to be a very critical consumer of data. And I'm always like, I present data after we've gone through multiple iterations, how we visualize this. And, I'm very skeptical. So yes, definitely being aware of, hopefully what I'm presenting makes people more cognizant of, the wider society they're a part of in the cities, forget the country, just the cities, right? But I think just stories, just like, I think the way I learn more about migrant workers is speak to them. Go ask them about where you're from. It's incredible. You have to understand, like I said, many of them come from lower caste backgrounds, women workers. They come from situations in which they're treated like not very well. They can't go around anywhere they want and talk to anybody you want. If you go have a nice chat with them, help them out, that's a huge thing for them, and so make them feel like Mumbaikars, make them feel like Delhiites, because that's what they are. They built our cities, for God's sake, So I think really telling these stories and really sort of, and I really, I think there are hopefully there are a lot of artists there. I really encourage artists to really engage with this issue. It's such a big part of what this country is all about. And I think we owe them. I honestly think we owe them right now. We owe them to be like, look, this will never happen again. Never, not on our watch, So I think telling the stories, a lot data is a part of it, and you can contextualize the stories. And people like me will always be there to do that. But let's also talk about the human stories.
Thank you so much, Varun. I think on that note, it is quite a humbling understanding of also the role that we as the larger citizens do need to play within these environments, and do whatever in our capacity to either donate, give time, or to even have chats and understand the situation better. So I would like to thank you again for doing this. Thank you so much. It really gave us a much deeper perspective and to understand the situation a lot better, because I think everyone's just trying to get their head around what is exactly happening. We've posted the link to India Migration Now in the chat, which is Varun's organization. So please have a look and see the work that they do. And also Pravasi, we'll send the link of that in the email as well.
Pravasi.help.
Pravasi.help, that's right. So we'll send it again in the link. But again, thank you so much, Varun. If everyone could send virtual claps and good energies Varun's way for him to continue doing the great work that he's doing, it would be very nice of you. Thank you, everyone. We will share the recording, and we will share all the Q&As with you as well. And we will try and answer a few more after this as well. Thank you so much, Varun. If you would like to say any words.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you for having me. And look, the next 18 months is going to be very tough for a lot of these workers and their households. I really encourage everybody. You don't have to be an activist. You don't have to be politically active. Just keep an eye. Really don't get your eye off this issue. This is our country. This is happening. There's going to be a very tough time ahead. Our economy is going to go through real doldrums with the crisis, the pandemic. Do what you can. At least at the very least, educate yourself about our own country. These people have gone back and they need, it's not about needing help. I don't want to portray them as someone who needs help. They are very capable of helping themselves, which is what migration is all about. But do educate yourself. Do force the issue with your policymakers. Demand more, help for them, or demand more rights for them. Maybe rights is a better word. Demand rights for them. Demand that when they come back, they're taken care of. Call your maids, call your drivers, call everybody. Talk to them. They're going through a tough time right now. Chantez, chantez, jouez, jouez, dansez, dansez.